On August 12th, 1941, the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives gavelled a vote closed before half the chamber understood what had happened. The margin was a single vote. It decided whether America would have an army. 4 months earlier, Hitler's Wehrmacht had torn through Yugoslavia and Greece in under 3 weeks. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than British yards could replace it. The Soviet Union, invaded on June 22nd, was hemorrhaging territory at a rate that made Western planners assume Moscow would fall before autumn. Britain stood alone in Western Europe, sustained by convoys being strangled in the North Atlantic. The world was on fire. And in Washington, the dominant question was not how to fight, but how to stay out of it. American isolationism in 1941 was not a fringe position. It was the center of gravity in national politics. The America First Committee, backed by Charles Lindbergh and funded by some of the wealthiest families in the country, commanded enormous public support. Gallup polls that summer showed more than 80% of Americans opposed entering the war. Congress reflected that sentiment with precision. Senators and representatives who voiced even cautious interventionism faced primary challenges in hostile town halls. The political cost of appearing to drag America toward a European conflict was, for most elected officials, career-ending. This was the atmosphere in which the Roosevelt administration attempted something that looked routine. The Selective Training and Service Act, signed in September 1940, had created the first peacetime military draft in American history. It conscripted 900,000 men for 12 months of service. By mid-1941, those 12 months were expiring. The act needed renewal by Congress, or it would lapse, and every man drafted under it would be legally entitled to walk away. The stakes were not abstract. The United States Army in 1941 was a fragile, half-built institution undergoing the largest expansion in its history. Divisions were still forming. Equipment was still arriving. Training programs were still being designed. The 900,000 men were not a surplus that could be safely released and recalled later. They were the foundation. Without them, the officers who had learned to lead them, the logistics chains that supplied them, and the unit cohesion that only months of shared training could produce, all of it would dissolve. You do not pause an army mid-construction and resume later. You start over. General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, understood this with a clarity that bordered on desperation. Marshall had spent 2 years fighting Congress for every dollar, every rifle, every training camp. He had watched the Army grow from a force smaller than Portugal's to something that might, given time, project power across an ocean. The draft renewal was not one priority among many. It was the single point of failure. Marshall told the administration privately that if the renewal failed, the Army would cease to exist as a deployable fighting force within 60 days. Not gradually, entirely. The problem was political, not military. The renewal vote was not a referendum on preparedness. It was a referendum on whether the United States intended to fight. Every isolationist in Congress framed it that way. A vote to extend the draft was a vote for war. And most Americans did not want war. The administration lobbied furiously. Roosevelt's allies reframed the renewal as basic national defense, not interventionism. They pointed to the Pacific, where Japan's imperial expansion was accelerating. They argued that an army in being was a deterrent, not a provocation. It was not enough. On August 12th, the roll was called. Members who had been avoiding commitment were cornered and pressed. The final tally was 203 in favor, 202 against. One vote. Speaker Sam Rayburn gavelled the result before opponents could demand a recount. There were shouts of protest, accusations of procedural manipulation, motions to reconsider. Rayburn held the gavel down and declared the matter settled. It was settled, barely. The man whose vote tipped the balance was Andrew Jackson May, a Democratic congressman from Kentucky's 7th District. May was not an interventionist by conviction. He was chairman of the House Military Affairs Committee, a position that gave him enormous influence over military contracts and procurement. His reasons for voting to extend the draft were, by most accounts, as much institutional as ideological. He understood what the collapse of the draft would mean for the military apparatus he oversaw. He also understood what that apparatus meant for his district. May's relationship with the military-industrial complex he helped govern would later prove darker than pragmatism. In 1947, he was convicted of accepting bribes from munitions manufacturers, a combine of war contractors who paid him to steer contracts their way. He was sentenced to federal prison. The man who saved the American Army did so for reasons that remain ambiguous. That ambiguity changes nothing about the result. Had the vote gone the other way, the Selective Training and Service Act would have lapsed. 900,000 men would have begun the legal process of discharge. Units would have fragmented. Equipment would have been returned to depots or left to deteriorate. The training pipeline would have collapsed. By late autumn of 1941, the United States Army would have been a skeleton force, under strength, under-equipped, and incapable of rapid mobilization. Pearl Harbor came 4 months later. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese struck the Pacific Fleet at anchor in Hawaii and threw the United States into a war spanning 2 oceans. With the draft intact, the army that existed on December 7th was not ready for war, but it was real. It had men. It had structure. It had the institutional capacity to scale. Within months, the United States was fielding forces in the Pacific and preparing for operations in North Africa. The timetable was punishing, but it was possible because the foundation had not been destroyed. Military historians have converged on a stark consensus. Without the draft renewal, American mobilization after Pearl Harbor would have been delayed by 12 to 18 months minimum. The Army would have restarted conscription from scratch, rebuilt dissolved units, and reconstructed logistics networks that had already been dismantled. North Africa in November 1942 would not have happened. Guadalcanal that August would not have been feasible. Every Allied operation in 1942 and early 1943 would have been pushed back or abandoned entirely. All of it turned on a single vote, cast by a congressman who would later go to prison for corruption, in a chamber that did not fully understand what it had just decided. The margin between the army that fought World War II and no army at all was 1.